Okay, this week is Parshas Mishpatim. And Parshas Mishpatim is a very, very technical parsha. It's the body of civil and criminal law of the Torah. So we're not going to get bogged down in the details. We're not going to lose the forest for the trees. But I'd like to make some general comments about the idea of Mishpatim. First, there is an idea which has been repeated so many times that it's virtually become a cliche, which is that the entire system of civil law and criminal law in the Torah is based on a premise which is very, very different than that of, let's say, the civil and criminal law of Canada or the United States or Britain, which is this, that the law generally, we tend to think, is based on the concept of rights. Individuals have rights, whether they are God-given rights or natural rights or rights of the social contract. That is not relevant to the particular point. But we have rights. And the reason we have government, the reason we have police, the reason we have courts, the reason we have laws is to enforce the individual rights. So you have a right to life, you have a right to property. So how is that going to be protected from people who would like to deprive you of that right? So we have a body of laws, and we have police, and we have courts, etc., to enforce your individual rights. The cliche is, and by the way, just to illustrate this, if you read the United States Declaration of Independence, which is probably one of the finest examples of Enlightenment political philosophy, that's how it starts. That man is endowed by his Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these being the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And as it goes on to explain, to these ends, governments are established, and so on and so forth. Torah starts from a different perspective. Torah starts from the obligation side. That there are obligations imposed upon us by the Ribono Shel Olam. That we are obligated to not steal and not kill and look out for one another, and so on and so forth. And it's a different orientation. Whereas we're not beginning with the fact that I have rights which I demand, but rather I have obligations which fall upon me to help you, to protect you, to save you from harm. Let's accept this as a given. But the corollary which follows from that is this, that the law in other than Torah societies tends to be a force which pits one person against the other. In other words, I have my rights, you have your rights, I'm standing up for my rights. Usually that necessitates the other person giving in, conceding. So in a sense, we create a situation where there's a competition. We are all opposed to one another because each person is asserting his rights in relation to the other person. In a system which is based on the idea of obligations, so the law brings us closer together. I am obligated to watch out for you. I have to take care of you. I have to be concerned for you. So the very theme of the law is that it creates a group solidarity. It brings us closer together. I just want to point out an interesting thing, that this week, in addition to being Parshas Mishpatim, is also Parsha Shkolim. It's also the first of the four special Parshias. And it relates to the annual collection of half shkolim for the purchase of the sacrifices in the Beis HaMikdash. And that collection was made, of course, during the month of Adar. So the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Adar, we read this parsha to commemorate the giving of the half shekel. This is often the case, that Parsha Shkolim falls up in Parshas Mishpatim. It's not just 1 in a million, a fluke. I can't say it's always the case, even usually the case, but it's often the case. that these two coincide. And that really is the idea of machzas hashekel. The idea of machzas hashekel is that we only become whole through our joining another person. Every person gives a half shekel. A half shekel symbolizes something which is fundamentally incomplete. Because when I join effort with you, when I cooperate with you, when I become your partner, then together we produce an entire shekel. That's not contrary to Mishpatim. It's not that the law, in a sense, divides us, and Shkolim somehow brings us together. But the theme of Shkolim is totally consistent with the theme of Mishpatim. Our body of Mishpatim brings us together because it is not, again, an assertion of individual rights as much as it is as an assertion of obligations we have to one another. The Mishpatim create a web, a network of obligations which brings us together as a people. Maybe in this light we can understand some very, very mysterious halachas, some of the laws of the Mishpatim, some that are in this week's parsha, some from other parshas. There is a law in the Torah of not taking interest. As a Jew is not allowed to charge interest on a loan. And the Torah says that l'nochri sashich, to a Gentile, one may lend an interest, but to your Jewish brother, you're not allowed to charge interest. And of course, we all know that money lending became a Jewish business because Christians also weren't allowed to charge interest to one another, but Jews could charge interest to Christians. The Jews became money lenders, and of course, we all know Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice, Shylock, the Jewish moneylender, and he's depicted in various ways depending on the producer's whim, how he wishes to depict him. But we all know this idea that Jews lend money on interest. There is a very, very astounding dispute in the Rishonim, in the medieval commentators, about this law. The Rambam says it is a mitzvah aseh. It is a positive command. It is obligatory for a Jew to charge interest when it's money to a non-Jew. The l'nochri sashich, when the pasuk says that you shall lend to the Gentile on interest, it isn't just a dispensation. It isn't just the Torah is telling us you're allowed to do it. The Torah is telling us you are obligated to do it. You cannot extend a free loan to a Gentile without charging interest. Now that probably doesn't mean lending the guy a quarter for the payphone. In other words, it means that the type of loan that you would charge interest for, let's say a mortgage loan or a business loan, a substantial sum of money, if it's the type of loan that traditionally is made on interest, one is not allowed to make such a loan, a free loan, to a Gentile, only to a Jew. One, to the contrary, is obligated to make a free loan, and one is not allowed to charge interest. Now, how do we understand that? How do we understand this halacha? There's a very important Ramban. The Ramban says the following. The Ramban says that when it comes to principles of justice, the Torah makes no distinction as a rule between Jew and Gentile. For example, when the Torah says that you can't steal, so it's not only that a Jew can't steal from a Jew can't steal from a non-Jew. There's no distinction. Because all human beings have to be treated in accordance with principles of justice. There's no exception to that rule. And that's what Ramban says. And it makes perfect sense. Justice is not something that is our thing. It's not just in our circle of friends we live in accordance with principles of justice. Justice is something that has to be practiced in all our dealings with human beings, whether they're co-religionists or not. I'll just mention an unfortunate thing as an aside. I don't know if you want to leave this on the tape or not, that sadly, many people don't realize this is true. And some people think that, it's only among Jews that we have to be honest and decent, and when we deal with the goyim, so to speak, it's wrong. It's not correct. But I want to explain where it may have come from. And this is something which I've said many times, and it's important to know that a lot of our Jewish customs, Jewish practices, aren't rooted in Torah and Jewish law. They're rooted in culture. They're part of our Jewish historical experience. I'll give you an example. Sometimes you have a person who takes an interest in religion, and he wonders, why is it that Jews eat such terrible things? I mean, it's the diet, so much animal fat and so much white flour. And why don't they eat more leafy vegetables and more fruits? Where did this diet come from? So it's important to explain that the Jewish cuisine is not rooted in Jewish law. There's nothing in Jewish law that says you have to eat Shemot and kishka and kugel and so on and so forth. If you want to eat broccoli and all that stuff, that's fine. Eat whatever you want as long as it's kosher. But it happens to be, for many hundreds of years, Jews lived in parts of Europe which were very, very cold for much of the year. And green vegetables were not always available. What did they have? They had animals which they could slaughter, so the diet contained a lot of meat and animal fat. And they had flour, that of course would keep you year-round, and therefore they dealt with cuisine. You had the lakshin, you had noodles, and you had shom, beans also keep you year-round, and you had kugel. And what's kugel made of? It could be made of potatoes, it could be made of noodles, it could be made of all sorts of things.
Roots.
Root vegetables, and that was the cuisine. Sounds terrible, right?
Not the Sephardim.
Not the Sephardim. They lived in different countries. But Ashkenazi cuisine, what was that? So there's no halakha, there's no law you have to eat these things. Right? It just happens to be that this is part of the culture. And I'm a first generation American. My parents were immigrants from Europe, and my mother certainly cooked as her mother cooked, and as her mother cooked, and they lived in Poland for many generations, and that's how I was raised. So I like kugel. What can I tell you? I have a weakness. But there's nothing in Jewish law that demands that you eat these foods specifically. It's a cultural thing. People eat what they're accustomed to eating. For many centuries, Jews lived in oppressive societies where they were manipulated, they were cheated, they were extorted, and sometimes survival demands that you have to deal at your dealt with. If the people are going to cheat you at every juncture, then you may just have to cheat back just to survive, to be able to manage on some level. So therefore, there probably was, in many places in Europe, there was a tendency to play fast with some of the rules in terms of business dealings and so on and so forth. Again, if they're out to cheat you, then you might want to do that back. Very much like Yaakov Avinu told Rachel that he'll outsmart Lavan. Of course, how it worked out is a topic for discussion, but that's what Yaakov said. With an honest person, you deal honestly, and with a cheat, you have to assert your rights. So when Jews came to America, they were coming with a certain amount of cultural baggage, patterns and ways that had developed over the centuries. Now they come to America, it's a society of laws, not of men, and there are courts of law, and things are conducted honestly, but old habits are hard to break. So sometimes you have people that just don't get it. They don't understand that the times have changed, the circumstances have changed. And sadly, you have people that engage in these activities, and sometimes there are episodes which can only be characterized as a terrible chilul Hashem, a terrible desecration of God's name. And it's very sad. It's very sad. The fact that these things are newsworthy should be a source of comfort to us. It means that, as a rule, this isn't going on. The exceptional case obviously makes the newspapers, as the cliche goes, that dog bites man is in news, but man bites dog, would be news. So the same thing that see, this Jew is involved in financial scandal. The fact that it's newsworthy means that thank God is rare, but it does happen. It does happen. I think it's part of the cultural baggage of the old country, so to speak. But this Ramban says that a Jew is obligated in all his dealings with any human being to conduct himself in accordance with principles of justice. But says the Ramban, there is really nothing wrong with charging interest. Charging interest is totally consistent with the principles of justice. Interest is simply the cost of money. So in the same way that when you rent a car, you pay for the car, you rent a house, you pay for the house. So you're renting money, so to speak, you're paying for the use of money. There is absolutely nothing wrong with charging interest in terms of justice. And our whole society runs on that. Banks extend credit, they charge interest. This is how they stay in business. And this facilitates growth of business and so on and so forth. There is a critique, by the way, of interest. Marx, Das Kapital, really is a critique essentially of a society which is based on interest. The critique is that the capitalists, the people that have the money, really protect themselves and don't become partners in the enterprises which they fund. But, we're not going to transform society from top to bottom. Banks that charge interest do perform a vital function in a modern economy. So there's nothing unjust with charging interest. But you don't charge interest to your brother, says the Rambam. In other words, this is a kindness that family members extend to one another. Your son wants to buy a house. If you're in a position to help him with the down payment, you give him a few $1,000s. You don't say, okay, this is the payment schedule and this is the interest rate. If you're able to do it, you do it happily, you do it gladly. This is a kindness that we extend to members of the family. The Torah is telling us that Jews are obligated to see themselves as members of a family. In other words, every Jew sees every other Jew as a family member. It's not that my children, my siblings, my parents, no, that's family, and that other person is a stranger. In other words, we're all children of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and we're family. And therefore the considerations that we extend to family, we extend to one another. And that's what the Torah says, that Jews do not charge interest. And again, that applies not only to native-born members of the family, it applies to adoptive members of the family too. In other words, a person converts and joins the fold, he's a member of the family, just like an adopted child is a member of the family. Right? A family has children, and they adopt a new child. He's a full-fledged sibling through the process of adoption. That's what conversion is. Conversion is not merely embracing a religion. It's important to understand that. Maybe someday we'll talk about conversion. It's this misconception. When a person converts to Judaism, it isn't just that you are embracing a new religion. You are joining a family. You're becoming a member of the family. It's important to understand that. You're joining a nation. Maybe this, if I can go off on a tangent for a moment and comment on that. The Talmud says like this. The Talmud says that when a convert comes to convert, so they ask him questions. They want to discourage him because they want to make sure that he's sincere. So they say to him, don't you know that Jews nowadays are persecuted and tormented and etc.? Like, why would you want to become Jewish? So if the convert says, I'm aware of that, but even so, then figure that, well, if he's willing, even under those conditions, to convert, then we welcome him with open arms. Now, my question is, why isn't there a very simple answer to that question? Why can't the prospective convert say, he says, I have no intention of joining the Jewish nation? I'm not going to be persecuted or tormented. He says, I just want to embrace the Jewish religion. I want to embrace the Jewish theology, the Jewish conception of God, and practice the commandments. I have no intention of joining the Jewish nation, that I should share in their troubles and their persecutions. That's not my idea. But why doesn't the prospective convert answer that? The answer is because there's no such thing. There is no option to embrace the Jewish religion and not be a member of the Jewish nation, not to be a member of the Jewish family. That doesn't exist. There's no mechanism for that. There's no mechanism for buying into the religion but not buying into Jewish nationhood. In other words, it's a package deal. Right? By embracing the religion, you become a member of the family. You become a member of the nation. Because what it means to be a Jew is not simply to profess to a creed. To be a Jew means to be a member of a people, to be a member of a family. Right? It may be that the process of conversion involves studying the religion, accepting the religion, and adapting the religion. That's just the formal method of conversion. But what you achieve in the process of conversion is you become a member of the family.
One could argue the family relationship is greater than the religious relationship.
In a way, it certainly is, because we know that Jews remain Jews even if they forsake the religion. Yisrael, Yisrael, the Jew is a Jew. So in any case, we have the natural-born members and we have the adopted members, and we're all members of a family. And to members of a family, you don't charge interest. This is a courtesy that family members extend to one another, the Ramban says. And therefore, it's not a violation of justice to charge interest to the Gentiles. Now, to the Gentile, I deal in accordance with the highest standards of justice. But to the Jew, I deal as a brother, as a member of the family. And that accounts for the difference. The Rambam now is saying a tremendous chiddush. The Rambam is saying something which is fantastic. It's very, very deep. Let's say I would take the following position. I love humanity. I love humanity. I'm going to treat every human being as if he's my brother. Is that reasonable? Now, special relationships have to be special. In other words, you should not treat every human being as you treat your brother. Your brother has to be special. You might want to treat people better than they'd be treated otherwise, but there still has to be something special about your brother. There has to be something special about your wife. I have to tell you, maybe this you don't want to put on the tape, but there is a biography of Lyndon Johnson written by Robert Caro. He's finished the 4th volume already. He's just gotten to the point where Johnson has become president. Anyway, needless to say, Johnson had his extramarital affairs, and his wife knew all about it. Lady Bird Johnson knew all about what Lyndon was doing, and she was once asked about it, and she says, "Well, Lyndon just loves all of humanity." It's very nice that you love all humanity, but your wife still has to be special, right? You don't treat every woman in the world the way you treat your wife, or vice versa. Special relationships have to be special. If you try to take the love which is meant to be directed to a close family member, and you try to spread that across all humanity, you're really spreading too little butter over too much bread. There's not enough to go around, right? There has to be something special about the relationships. It can't be that I'm a citizen of the world and I treat everybody the same, and strangers and my own children. there's something special about your own children. If everybody would treat their own children specially, the world would be better than if we dissipate our love and try to treat everybody as if they were our children. In other words, I think more people would get what they need if we treated our own children as they deserve than if we try to become these cosmopolitan people who are equally concerned for everybody. So the Rambam says like this. The Rambam says that therefore those kindnesses which are extended to family, you must not extend to strangers. Right? Because when you extend them to everybody, then you are undermining the special relationship which is meant to be. For whatever reason God wants that there should be Jewish solidarity, there have to be certain considerations which are extended only to those in the family. You can't extend them to everybody else. So the Rambam says that when the Torah says that to the non-Jew you charge interest, it doesn't mean that you're allowed to charge interest. It means you must charge interest. In other words, you treat them with justice. You treat your brother with love. That's the lesson of the Rambam. But that means that in the Mishpatim, as we said, there really are two sets of considerations. There are Mishpatim that are rooted in pure justice. And those Mishpatim are obviously meant to be directed to all human beings. And then there are the special Mishpatim that regulate our relationships with fellow Jews, and there's a different consideration. There the consideration is not pure justice. It's really something that goes beyond justice. It's love. It is meant to create a certain solidarity, a group solidarity, a unity that brings us together, and therefore there are different Mishpatim. There are certain laws which regulate the relationships between Jews and among Jews, and they have a different function. It isn't just purely considerations of justice. It is really to create a group solidarity, a group unity. If you look in Parshas Mishpatim, you see an amazing thing. I'll make the general point and then come back to this specific point. In our 21st century conception of jurisprudence, we imagine that there should be a separation of religion and law, separation of church and state, synagogue and state. And we see that as an ideal. That's the way it should be. You know, render unto God what is God, or render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Now that really is the ideal. And the truth is this: that we as Jews, as a minority, thrive in societies that have this separation of church and state. So we live in the United States, we live in Canada. The government doesn't interfere with our practice of religion. That's a good thing. But we have to avoid falling into the trap of confusing that which is convenient and pleasant and helpful with that which is philosophically ideal. Because we as Jews do not believe that the ideal government is a government which is valueless. Because we are opportunists, so therefore if we're going to be living in America, if we're going to be living in society as a minority, it's better for us to live in a society which has a strict separation of church and state. And this way no one is going to stop us from practicing our religion, no one is going to tell us what to do, what we can't do. So it's true, right? If we're living as a minority, it's the best thing. But let's say in Israel, is this what we should hope for? We should hope for a state which is totally empty of Jewish value? I think not. I don't think we should see that as a goal. There are those that would advocate this. There are those who would say that Israel should not, its government should not promote religions. Not the Jewish religion, not any religion. It should be a totally secular state. There should be freedom of religion. You should be able to practice whatever you want to practice. That the government should protect. But the government should not fund, the government should not support, the government should not encourage the practice of religion. The idea of separation of church and state as in the United States and other democracies should be transplanted to Israel. So is that something that we would see as desirable? I think not. I think not. I think that a Jewish state has to have a Jewish character. And I'll tell you the truth, that just having come back, this is still fresh in my mind. It seems to me that as much as there are in Israel they have what in America would be called the establishment. You have the public intellectuals, who are influential in the media and in politics and so on and so forth. But it seems to me that they are very, very much out of touch with the people. It may be that you read the newspapers, you get the impression that everyone is a leftist, and maybe if you watch television, you might get that impression too. But the reality is that the good people in Israel, whether they are religious or whether they're not religious, are steeped in Jewish culture to an extent which is unimaginable in North America. Just to illustrate something, this is something which is an example from 35 years ago when I studied in Israel as a boy. So I once saw an ad in the newspaper. It was an ad for stereo speakers. And the picture in the ad showed Moshe Rabbeinu coming down the mountain, holding instead of two tablets, two stereo speakers, right? And the caption was the verse says, "V'chol ha'am ro'im es hakolos." The entire nation saw the sound. Now, the point was, is it sacrilegious? Should you use a pasuk for that? Should you use the image of Moshe Rabbeinu? That's irrelevant. The point is that it was something that the culture would appreciate. In other words, this is something that even people that weren't personally religious would enjoy seeing Moshe Rabbeinu carrying down two stereo speakers from Mount Sinai. Now, again, it may be that 35 years later it wouldn't resonate the same way. I don't know. There may be changes in society to a certain extent, but it seems to me that even today, the tempo of the state still has a lot of Jewish character. In other words, you can write a check, you can still put on the Jewish date on the check. You don't have to put the secular date. And the stores are selling the foods that are associated with the upcoming holiday. So between Sukkot and Hanukkah, you have the Sufganiyot, and between Hanukkah and Purim, you have the Hamantashen, and after that, they sell more honey in the 2 weeks before Rosh Hashanah than the entire year put together. I mean, it's just that this is part of the culture. And I think the calls for separation of church and state and civil marriage and the like are really, something that maybe the intelligentsia is in favor of, but I don't think the rank and file of the citizens really are clamoring for this. But I think that they want that the state should have a Jewish character. And if you look in the Mishpatim, in this body of criminal and civil law, you see an amazing thing. Take the very first law. And this is a very curious thing about the Torah generally. The Torah doesn't present its legal system in a organized, structured way. It doesn't start with first principles and build on them. It throws you right into cases. And the first case it deals with is the law of a Jewish servant, an Eved Ivri. And the Torah says, if you buy a Jewish servant, and we're not going to get into that, maybe another time we should devote some time to discussing the institution of slavery, servitude in the Torah, because again, it's something which is foreign to us. We see it as abhorrent. And the Torah does consider it as something which is reasonable. So the Torah says that the servant can only be sold for a term of 6 years, and the 7th year he goes free. That's the first law of the Mishpatim, the law that the Eved Ivri, that the Hebrew slave, goes free in the 7th year. The Ramban says that why does the entire chapter of Mishpatim begin with this particular law? So the Ramban explains because these Mishpatim are really a supplement to the Aseres Hadibros, to the 10 Commandments, which were in last week's Parsha. And, of course, one of the Aseres Hadibros is the mitzvah of Shabbos. Right? We work for 6 days and we rest on the 7th. That testifies to the fact that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. So whenever you see a mitzvah where you have 6 and a 7th, it really is a commemoration of the act of creation. And if for this law as well, that you buy a Jewish servant, that he works for 6 years and goes free in the 7th, as well is a commemoration of the fact that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. That's what the Ramban says. Which means that in a law, in a society rather, where there was a strict separation of church and state, there could not be such a law. Right? This law is to promote a religious ideal. To acknowledge that God is creator, 6 days, rested on the 7th. So therefore the law of servants also reflects that. You work for 6 years, the 7th you go free. So it seems from here we see that the Mishpatim are not secular. They're not simply to promote principles of justice or even simply group solidarity. No, they are also meant to advance religious ideals. Now, that's the first of the Mishpatim. What is the last of the Mishpatim? What is the last, in this whole body of law, what is the last topic to be taken up? Is really, in a sense, the law of the Aliyah L'Regel, the annual pilgrimage to Yerushalayim. This is near the end of chapter 23. That 3 times a year, all Jews are meant to go on a pilgrimage to Yerushalayim. That is the conclusion of the Mishpatim. Of all the possible laws, how does that fall into the chapter of Mishpatim? As we said, that the purpose of the Mishpatim is not simply that we should live in accordance with justice. It's in order to promote a connection, a unity of the people. That's why we have certain Mishpatim that are principles of justice that are applicable to all mankind. We have certain Mishpatim that are principles of love that are directed to our co-religionists. But the idea of group solidarity is not just simply that we're members of the tribe, so to speak. No, there is an ideal. There is a national ideal that we all have to strive for. You meet a person who is a Jewish atheist, and yet he's very, very, he feels very much Jewish. To me, I don't understand it. I don't understand where it comes from. Like, in what sense do you feel Jewish? In what sense do you identify with the Jewish people? In other words, just because you look alike and you've had certain historical experiences, why stick with it? Why not give it up? What is the point of remaining a Jew if you don't buy into the fundamental ideals of Judaism? That, by the way, is why the process of conversion, even though, as we said, it is a process by which you join the Jewish nation, can only be done through embracing the Jewish religion. In other words, there is no way to join the nation without embracing the ideals of the nation. So it's not, on the one hand, simply embracing the religion. On the other hand, it's not simply embracing the nationhood. Right? You become a member of the nation by adopting the principles of the nation. And that means if you don't adopt the principles of the nation, so there's something deficient in your nationhood. Look, it's true, right? In other words, you can be a citizen of Canada because you happen to be born here, and totally antagonistic to whatever Canada stands for. But I wouldn't call you a Canadian in good standing. You're not a true red-blooded Canadian. In other words, if it just happens to be the accident of birth, you're here, but you don't believe in what Canada stands for. As a Jew as well, You're technically a Jew. You're born a Jew. You're a Jew. But if you reject the ideals of Judaism, so like, what is the content of that Jewishness? So here the Torah tells us that it's not just that we want to all get along together. So we have Mishpatim. It's more than that. The solidarity, the group connection that we want to build is in order that we be united in the national ideal. And therefore, what is the highest expression of the national ideal? When we come together as a group for the joint devotion to God on the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 pilgrimage holidays. When all Israel assembles in Yerushalayim, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, to serve God and to behold God, to acknowledge God, that really is the highest fulfillment of the ideal of the Mishpatim. And therefore, the law is not simply to prevent anarchy, and it's not simply that we should feel close to one another, but it's that we should feel close in the fulfillment of the national ideal which we strive to achieve. Therefore, the Aliyah L'Regel is the conclusion of the PARSHA of the Mishpatim. I want to mention something which has some relevance. Well, hopefully it doesn't have relevance, but it can have relevance. You know, the very first verse of Mishpatim begins, Ve'ela ha-mishpatim asher tasam lifneim. These are the laws that you shall place before them. Who is you and who is them? The pronouns are funny things. You have to know what the antecedent of the pronoun is. So Rashi has 2 different interpretations of this verse, and each of them has a very, very important lesson. The first is, you is a reference to Moshe, and Lifneihem is a reference to the Jewish people. Because these are the Mishpatim that you shall put in front of every last Jew. And putting it in front of them means that you don't merely recite it or repeat it 1 or 2 times, but you place it in front of them clearly as a Shulchan Aruch, as a set table, where you're ready to partake of the feast. Now let's understand what that means. In Canada, in the United States, we have laws. There are law books, volumes and volumes and volumes of laws and court decisions. There is no ideal that everybody should be conversant in the law. And the law is considered a technical body of knowledge. It's for lawyers to know, to adjudicate, judges, etc. The average person, it's not part of his curriculum to know the law. Ironically, despite that fact, ignorance of the law is not excused. So a person will find himself in violation of the law, and he'll be called in on that, and they'll say, listen, how should I have known that? No, ignorance of the law is no excuse. I mean, how in the world were you expected to know what the law was? It isn't taught in schools, it isn't broadcast in the media, right? The books aren't accessible. Sometimes, it's an amazing thing. We have a school, and we are inspected by the Ministry of Education, and the inspector will come, and they'll tell us that according to the regulations, you have to do things a certain way, this way, this way, this way, this way, and we'll ask them, well, where does it say that? So it says, it says that in the ministry document, such and such. And we ask them, well, where do we get a copy of that? So, well, it hasn't been published yet. So that's right. You have no way of knowing, but we're telling you now that this is the way it has to be. And sometimes it's just like that. We're expected to know, but there's no way for us to know. This is HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling Moshe Rabbeinu that for Klal Yisrael, the Mishpatim are meant to be placed in front of every Jew. There is an ideal of universal literacy in matters of the law. Not only in matters of the rituals that we perform every day, but in matters of the law, the civil law, the criminal law. This is something asher tasim lifneim, that should be placed in front of every Jew. And you go into a Jewish school, and the youngest kids who are just learning Gemara, beginning Gemara. I have a son; he's 11 years old. He's learning Gemara for the first time, and they're learning Maseches Bava Metzia, Perek Metzias, which deals with the laws of lost property and the obligation to return lost property, and under what conditions can you keep lost property, and if there are disputes, and so on and so forth. It's no technical material, right? It might be material that would be covered, in a law school class, and he's in grade 5, and they're doing it, right? This is part of the ideal that every Jew should be literate and knowledgeable in the areas of the law. This is something which is not technical, meant for the technocrats who are going to settle cases. Maybe they have to have a more detailed knowledge of the law, but a basic competence in the halacha, to know what the obligations are as civil law, etc., business law. Everyone has to do this. There was a fabulous thing I once heard. You all know what a kollel is. A kollel is people that are older, more advanced, have gone to yeshiva already, they may be married, studying a kollel. So there was such an institution, one of the first of its type, in Kovna, was the capital of Lithuania, the famous Kovna kollel, and quite competent scholars studied there. But not everyone went into the rabbinate or into a Jewish profession. Sometimes after a number of years, the people that studied in this kollel went into business. So they had a rule that if a person went into business, he was going to leave the kollel to go into business, he had to take a test on the entire section of Shulchan Aruch, Rosh and Mishpat, which dealt with the entire range of civil business law. He had to take a test. So the question was, what happens if he would fail the test? If he failed the test, he had to stay in the kollel until he passed the test. It says, you're going into business, you can't go into business until you know the entire Rosh and Mishpat. So you're going to go into business and be ignorant of what the law, what the Jewish law demands of you? You can't be a businessman. Because people think that, if I want to be a rabbi, I have to know Jewish law. If I want to be a ritual slaughterer, I have to know Jewish law. If I want to be a businessman, I can do that without anything. No, to the contrary. You want to be a businessman, you have to know the halacha that pertains to business. So they insisted you had to take a test. You failed the test, stay in a kollel. Don't go out there and go into business. But as for the Aveila Mishpatim, this is God's command, that Moshe has to put the law in front of every last Jew, and not just mention it and refer to it, but he should put it in front of them as a Shulchan Aruch, as a set table, that they have it arranged in their own minds and they can access the halacha and they know exactly what they're meant to be. And that's why, of course, the Shulchan Aruch is called the Shulchan Aruch. It's based on this metaphor which the Rashi here uses, that it's not meant to be something you have to put together. It's not like a mix. You have to combine the ingredients and cook it. It's there. It's ready to eat. That's what it has to be. But your knowledge of the law has to be that you can get your hands right on the bit of information you need. That's the first pshat of Rashi. And that itself is a very, very, very interesting thing. It really points to one thing which is unique about the Jewish way of thinking. But there's another interpretation, Rashi says, that it doesn't refer to Moshe putting the law in front of the Jews. It refers to the litigants putting the matter in front of the courts. These are the types of judgments which the litigants shall place in front of them meaning the Jewish courts, and not Erko Shalakum, not non-Jewish courts. That's what Rashi says. There's an obligation. A Jew has to go to a Beis Din. A Jew should not settle his disputes in a non-Jewish court. And Rashi says that when a Jew settles his disputes in a non-Jewish court, it's a chilul Hashem, it's a desecration of God's name, because in those days, the alternative to the Jewish courts were the Gentile courts that were rooted in idolatry, and therefore it was a desecration of God's name. And the commentators explain as follows. You know, you have a court, and the court's going to judge, and the court is going to say, you pay him, or you don't pay him. So the question is, well, what gives the court the right to tell me what to do or what not to do, and who owes who, and what gives them the authority? A court has to derive its authority from somewhere. Now, for much of human history, government derived its legitimacy from above. You know, divine right of kings, so on and so forth. So the government was considered as having received its powers from heaven. So who in heaven? Where in heaven? No, a Jewish court derives its authority from God, right? A court in a nation that practices idolatry apparently receives its legitimacy from the idol that nation worships. So if you go to a court which is under the jurisdiction of Baal, right, you're acknowledging the authority of Baal. How can you go to such a court? How can you go to such a court? Because you're a servant of Hashem. You can't go to a court that acknowledges Baal. So that's why going to going to the idolatrous courts was particularly abhorrent. There's some that want to say that nowadays it's less of a problem. It says why? Because nowadays the very doctrine of the divine right of kings is fallen into disrepute. Nowadays, where do governments derive their legitimacy from? From the governed, social contract, right? Government of the people, by the people, for the people. So when you go to a secular court, you're not going to a court which derives its legitimacy from above. You're going to a court which derives its legitimacy from below, from the consent of the governed. Maybe it is less of a problem, but it's still not ideal. Because what essentially you are saying is that I don't want to be subject to the court which derives its authority from Hashem. I'm happy to be subject to the authority of the court which derives its authority from the governed. Right? So what should a Jew want? As a Jew should want to be reliant on the court which sees itself as deriving its authority from the Rebbeinu Shalom. And therefore this is something that you should never be involved in a dispute. You should always get along with your neighbors, never have any problems. But if there would be a problem, you should know that this is an obligation to go to a beis din, to a Jewish court, to settle the dispute. And the truth is, you should know that it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. You know, when Jews have a disagreement and they say, we're going to go to the beis din and find out what the Torah says, it's a glorious thing. It's a wonderful thing. People put aside their differences, and they put aside their personal interests, and they say, we are going to go and find out what the Rebbeinu Shalom wants of us. And we're going to consult the beis din and see what the Torah says, what the halakha says, and we're going to act accordingly. It's really a beautiful thing. You know, I'm not saying that you should ever find yourself in a dispute, right? But it's not the kind of thing that you should want to avoid like the plague. Or there is something to be said for the idea of wanting to hear the ruling from the Rebbeinu Shalom himself through his appointed judges as to what the Torah wants should be done in this given situation. So that's a very, very important thing to know. Sadly, we sometimes in many Jewish cities lack efficient but they din for lack of resources. You know, it's like everything. That if you want people to do a good job, you have to pay them to be able to do that job. So if you want to have dayanim, you want to have Jewish judges who are competent and who are able to devote themselves to the needs of the community, they have to be paid. Well, that costs money, and in cities where there are many, many needs, you need schools and synagogues and whatnot. Sometimes to have a bezdin is the last thing that people think they need. It may be the one thing that is most important, to keep the peace. So sadly, it's a problem. So what's the consequence? The consequence is you have people doing this on the side. You have an organization which is officially called the Bezdin, but it's really manned by people who are doing 10 jobs already. They're rabbanim of shuls, they teach in yeshivas, etc., 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 and they come together on an ad hoc basis as needed, to hear litigation. Not the ideal thing. So, when we daven SHMOS next, and we say Yeshiva Shovteinu Kavri Shana, we ask God to restore our system of justice. We have a lot to pray for. When the system of justice is restored, a lot of the distress, a lot of the divisions in Jewish life can be easily settled. Okay, everyone, thank you for listening. We'll get together next week.